This lesson, you're watching our continuation of lesson 1. In this lesson, we'll be talking about how to add and subtract fractions. This will be a relatively short video. I just wanted a video on its own because adding and subtracting fractions tends to be something that challenges many students. And so students could understand how to find equivalent fractions, mixed numbers, unmixed fractions, simplify fractions, but then adding and subtracting tends to catch them. So we're going to take our time with this and we're going to take it slow. So, how do we add or subtract fractions? Well, it depends. You need to look at your denominators, right? It really depends on your denominators. So take a moment to look at these two different fractions equations, right? Take a look at these two different fraction equations and see if you can find the difference between these two. Right? So you may have noticed that this denominator and this denominator is different. Well, it really matters because if your denominators are the same, adding and subtracting fractions are really easy. If your denominators are different, you have to take a few extra steps. So let's begin. If the denominators are different, you need to make them the same, right? You can multiply each fraction by the other denominator. So in this case, we have 4 over 10 plus 3 over 5. Well, I want to turn both denominators into the same fraction. Well, I can take this denominator, the 5 here, right? I can take the 5 here, and then multiply this fraction by it. So I multiply this by 5 and this by 5. And then I take this denominator, and I multiply the other fraction by it. I multiply this by 10 and this by 10. So 5 times 4 is 20, 10 times 5 is 50, 3 times 10 is 30, 5 times 10 is 50, 20 plus 30 is 50. You don't touch the denominators if they're the same, right? Once your denominators are the same, you don't touch them. They stay the same. So then you have 50 over 50, which is the same as saying 1, right? 1 whole. Adding and subtracting mixed numbers. Well, you have to turn them into improper fractions. How do you turn a fraction into an a mixed number into an improper fraction? So let's say I had 2, 3 over 5. Okay. Well, the way you would do this is you'd say, well, this 2 represents how many wholes I have, right? How many whole sets I have. Well, this 5 is telling me how much are in a set, right? So this 5 is telling me how many are in a set. And this 2, or this whole number, is telling me how many sets I have. Well, I have 2 sets. Well, each set is 5. So I have 2 sets of 5, which means that's 10, right? So I can go 5 times 2, which is 10, and then I just add it to the top. So 5 times 2 is 10, add to 3, it's 13 over 5, right? That's how you turn a mixed number into an improper fraction. And that makes it a little bit easier to deal with sometimes, especially when your denominators are different, right? So let's try another number. Let's try 5 with 4 over 6. Okay, well again, I have 5 sets of 6, so 6 times 5 is 30, added to the 4. So now I have 34 over 6. And there you go. And now you could simplify it by dividing it by 2, right? Right? And so you could get 17 over 3, and you can't really work with that anymore, so that would be the simplified improper fraction. And so turning improper fractions into turning mixed numbers into improper fractions is a good step to make things relatively easy. So before we move on, try and turn these two fractions into improper fractions. And then we'll move on from there. All right, so in this case, hopefully you did this. You go 3 times 8, or 8 times 3, plus 1. Oops. Let's try that again. 8 times 3 plus 1, right? 8 times 3 plus 1. Then I go 3 times 2 plus 2. 3 times 2, or 2 times 3, plus 2. And then I just do it all at the top. So 8 times 3, 24, plus 1, 25. 2 times 3, 6, plus 2, 8. So now I have 25 over 8 minus 8 over 3. Right? And then you just solve it like you normally would with adding and subtracting fractions. So you go, all right, I have 25 over 8 minus 8 over 3. Well, my denominators are different, right? So what I want to do is I want to take this denominator and multiply this fraction by it. So I multiply this by 8, and I multiply this by 8. And I take this denominator, and I multiply this fraction by it. So I go times 3 times 3, right? So 3 times 25, 3 times 8, 8 times 8, 8 times 3, right? I end up with 75 over 24 minus 64 over 24. My denominators are now the same, so I don't touch them. That's my denominator. 75 minus 64 is 11. So now I have 11 over 64. Right? So this is the way I like to solve them. There are different ways, and if you've learned different ways and they work, that's totally fine. This is just the way I like to solve them. It gets rid of any whole numbers. It gets rid of any other number other than fractions, and you're only dealing with fractions. So you need to practice adding and subtracting fractions because they are a challenge. And knowing that all you have to do is just multiply the denominators to each other fraction, and you'll get the same denominator, and then you just add or subtract, right? Just like here, right? 10 and 5, I just multiplied these two. So hopefully you found that useful, and I'll see you next lesson.